We talk a lot about discrimination, but how do you go beyond just stories and anecdotes? How do you actually prove it's happening? Well, today we're going to break down the really clever scientific method researchers came up with to do exactly that, to measure something that's usually invisible.
Right. This is the big question. Let's say you apply for a job and you get rejected. Was it because you weren't the right fit? Or was it something else? Maybe your name, your background, your religion. The thing is, for an individual, it's pretty much impossible to ever know for sure. And that, right there, is the core challenge. An employer can always say, oh, we just found a more qualified candidate. It's so easy to deny. So to get around this, social scientists needed to come up with a way to make this unseen bias totally visible, and what they landed on was brilliant. They call it the resume experiment, or sometimes a correspondence test. I like to think of it as a kind of undercover investigation into the hiring process. But instead of secret cameras, it uses cold, hard data.
So here's how it works, and it's actually incredibly simple. Researchers create pairs of totally fake resumes. They're identical in every important way. Same school, same GPA, same work experience. The only thing they change is one little detail that signals a different ethnic or religious background. Usually, it's just the name. Then, they send thousands of these out to real job ads, and they wait. They just count who gets a callback. It's basically a giant A/B test for hiring bias.
Now, to measure all this, they use a really important metric called the callback ratio, or CR. All it is the number of callbacks the majority applicant gets divided by the number of callbacks the minority applicant gets. So if the CR is 1.5, it means the majority candidate had a 1.5 times better shot at getting that call. If the CR is 1, that means no discrimination. That's our baseline. It's a really simple, powerful number.
Okay, but before we get to the numbers, we gotta understand the why. Like, what is actually going on inside an employer's head when this happens? Researchers usually break it down into two main types of discrimination. First, you've got something called statistical discrimination. This isn't really about hate. It's more of a cold risk management calculation. An employer uses a stereotype as a mental shortcut. They might think, well, on average, people from this group are less reliable, so they play the odds, even if that specific person is amazing. Then you have taste-based discrimination, and this one's a lot more straightforward. It's just plain old prejudice. An employer simply feels more comfortable with or prefers to work with people who are like them. All right, so we've got the method and we've got the theory. Now it's time for the evidence. What happens when you put all the results from dozens and dozens of these experiments together from all across the Western world? Well, a massive meta-analysis did just that. It pulled together the data from 54 different resume experiments. This gives us the clearest, biggest picture of hiring discrimination we've ever had. And honestly, the results are pretty stark. Okay, get this. The single biggest finding was that, on average, a candidate with a typical majority-sounding name was almost twice as likely to get a callback for an interview than an equally qualified candidate with a name that sounded like they were from a Muslim-majority country. That's a callback ratio of 1.93, nearly double the chance. And when you dig into the data, you start to see this really clear and kind of depressing hierarchy of bias. Candidates from Muslim-majority backgrounds faced the most discrimination, followed pretty closely by non-Muslim Black candidates, and then other non-Western immigrant groups. The numbers lay it out pretty clearly. But here's where it gets really interesting. It's not the same everywhere, not even close. When you zoom in on anti-Muslim discrimination country by country, the differences are huge. In France, the callback ratio was a staggering 2.64. Meanwhile, down in Germany, it was much, much lower at 1.20. So what's going on? Why the huge difference? Well, the research points to a fascinating answer. See, in Germany, when you apply for a job, it's normal to send a whole packet of information up front. Diplomas, transcripts, letters of recommendation. All this extra info gives the employer a much more complete picture of who you are as an individual. And that seems to help fight against that statistical discrimination we talked about. The more an employer knows about you, the less they have to rely on stereotypes. Now, let's go a layer deeper, because it's not just about a name. The experiments show that the more a resume explicitly signals a person's identity, especially their religion, the more the discrimination ramps up. And to really get the real-world vibe here, just listen to this. This is a direct quote from an employer in France. They said, "A girl wearing a headscarf was a nightmare to every recruiter." I mean, that's not some academic theory. That's the raw attitude, and it has a very real effect. So, a study in Germany put this to the test. They sent out two identical resumes for a woman with a Turkish name. The only difference? One application included a photo of her wearing a headscarf, and the other didn't. The results is just wow. The applicant with the headscarf was 3.4 times less likely to get a callback. The bias wasn't just about her background, it was specifically triggered by that visible symbol of her faith.
So what are the reasons employers actually give for this? Well, when researchers interviewed them in France, they heard a real mix of those two biases we talked about earlier. There were the statistical concerns, fears about extra costs for prayer rooms or work getting disrupted during Ramadan. But then you also had the purely taste-based stuff, like worrying it would hurt team unity or that their customers might be prejudiced.
And hey, it's important to note this method isn't just for the job market. Researchers have used this same technique, sending out identical applications with different names, to look at the rental housing market. And surprise, surprise, they find the exact same patterns of discrimination there too, although usually at slightly lower levels. So, okay, let's step back. After looking at all this evidence from dozens of these really careful, really clever experiments, what's the big takeaway? At the end of the day, the takeaway is crystal clear. What these studies do is they prove that discrimination isn't just a vague feeling or a personal story. It's a real, measurable phenomenon. It shows, with numbers, that for a lot of people, the playing field just isn't level. And that has huge, quantifiable consequences on their lives. And that leaves all of us with a final, really important question. The science has done its job. It's made the invisible visible. It's put a number on the bias. So when a problem is this clearly defined, when it's this measurable, what's the next step? What do we do about it? Thanks for joining us.